Brian, thanks so much for coming on the program, sir. Good talking to you again.
Thanks for having me on.
You bet. You've got a interesting piece over at Human Events right now, talking about a piece that Dan Mitchell from the Cato Institute had written. The European economic crisis highlights an increasingly important reason to oppose gun control. Now, I guess we're seeing these stories and reports from England. The British government actually warning what might happen if the euro were to fall, and they're talking about widespread social unrest, riots, almost a, I don't want to say a breakdown of the social order, but certainly not pleasant times ahead, it seems, in Europe.
That's a truth. And the piece, basically, what Dan Mitchell argued is we have a very interesting argument for Europeans to move forward with the natural right to keep and bear arms and to push that. The fact that you have all this social unrest, we just don't know what's going to happen. There are going to be individuals, and Dan spoke and wrote of how he met with some rich Europeans, and they all have plans to get out of the country if they do have a breakdown, if Greece starts to collapse, and that causes a domino effect. Your wealthy people have a place to go. They know what they're going to do. But if you're middle class or lower to middle class, you need to protect yourself, and you're not going to be able to flee the country. Maybe it's time for Europeans to take a second look at the concept we have here in the Second Amendment, the fact that you can protect yourself.
You know, and it's a good point, because it's not a situation that has existed, throughout Europe for all of its history. I mean, you can go back to Great Britain, and you can see the first gun laws starting to get passed in the 1920s, and then of course in the 1980s when they banned semi-automatic firearms and they banned handguns. And frankly, we can argue, Brian. I don't think the ban on gun possession in England has done much to help them in terms of their crime rate now, but certainly when we saw the riots break out, you had shopkeepers, you had business owners who were utterly defenseless, watching their livelihood literally go up in flames during those riots.
Yeah, that is the problem. And I'm not saying, and I wasn't arguing that necessarily there's going to be a complete breakdown in all of European society tomorrow.
Right.
But we're already seeing signs. We're seeing breakdowns. We're seeing riots in Greece and in England, and this may spread. And it is important for these Europeans to look differently at the natural right to protect oneself. The great thing we have in the United States of America is, even as bad as we say things are, especially on Second Amendment issues, we have a great deal of freedom. Both Republicans and Democrats, for the most part, support the idea that individuals should be able to have a firearm to protect themselves. And that's a wonderful freedom that we have that's ingrained in our system, but they just don't have that in Europe. They just don't have that freedom to even talk about these issues. When I tried to market my piece to the Daily Mail, they politely declined, because they just don't even want to have that discussion. They don't want to broach the subject of allowing citizens to have firearms, and that's a sad state of affairs.
It is. It is a sad state of affairs, and I'm kind of surprised that they turned that down, because there is among I think a sizable portion of Brits anyway. The idea that we do have a human right of self-defense, that we should be able to defend ourselves with the most effective tool available. I think that idea still has some hold over the folks there in Great Britain.
Yeah, I do think that there's a willingness on the part of people in Great Britain and throughout Europe to take a second look at this issue. And maybe, there are individuals over there that believe that they should have that right to keep and bear arms to protect themselves, because as we know, the bad guys will be able to get guns. They'll use them if there's a complete breakdown of society, and you don't have the government being able to protect anybody from anything. That's the ultimate situation where you need to protect yourself. And Dan Mitchell has said we need to watch out for when governments overspend to the point that they collapse and they cause social unrest by virtue of all this overspending. It's another argument to the Second Amendment that if a government collapses, the American people and Europeans and human beings need to have that right to defend themselves if there's all of a sudden a dissolution of government.
Yeah, and I got to say as well, the idea that we've seen over in Europe and here too, I think with the Occupy protests, Michael Moore came out with his ideas for Occupy Wall Street, and he wanted a second Bill of Rights. A lot of the complaints we're seeing, even in England right now, people are arguing that they have a right to a college degree or a college education. They have a right to a house, they have a right to a car, they have a right to all of what we would consider to be, in some cases, not just the necessities of life, but some of the bennies that you earn as well. And yet, despite all of these things that they want to claim as rights, that very basic concept, the human right of self-defense, seems to have fallen by the wayside in a lot of these European countries. And I wonder, Brian, if that has anything to do with the socialist mentality that you see across so many European governments.
Yeah, it's a mentality of dependency that's developed more acutely in Europe than it has here in the United States, because the people in Europe are much more dependent on government than they are here. They're dependent on it for everything. I mean, it's from healthcare to education. It's all paid for the most part by the government. So once you have that dependency and people getting used to being dependent on government, they want everything from free, and they believe that rights flow from the government giving them free healthcare, giving them food, giving them education, and that's not the way it should work. And those rights, those aren't rights. I mean, those are privileges, I guess, for those countries that the government is giving them something, but they have to take it from somebody else. It's a very different concept when you're talking about the freedom to defend oneself. That's an individual right that doesn't come from government. It's your right, and the government is trying to take it away. So it's a very different right, and it's a check against government power. But I had never really thought of it until reading the Mitchell piece. We believe that the Second Amendment is there because you look back to our revolutionary history, and we had to push off an oppressive government from far away. What if the government collapses and you don't have a government? That's another argument that people will need to defend themselves when there is no government by virtue of it just collapsing and imploding on itself.
It's a frightening thought, Brian. But I like you said, there are a lot of people in Europe who worry that day may not be too far away, or at least out there on the horizon. Listen, I appreciate you coming on the program tonight, sir, and look forward to having you on again very soon.
Yes, thanks for having me on.
All right, Brian Darling joining us from the Heritage Foundation here on NRA News.